Okay, by now a lot of you have probably watched my updated video on the worst movies I've ever done on my channel, so now let's talk about the best ones, because contrary to what some of you might think, I do sometimes talk about good movies on my channel. It goes without saying that all the movies I pick here fall under the cult classic category. They might be a little weird, they might be a little gory, they might not be for everybody, but each of them has something going for them that makes them worth recommending. And I've actually shifted a little bit more towards doing genuine cult classics in recent years rather than just straight up bad movies, even though I still do those ones, obviously. So here are the best movies I've ever reviewed, 300th episode edition. There's some movies that seem like they were born to be cult classics, and the movie I'm going to talk about today is definitely one of them. Number 10, Dog Soldiers. Now here we have a great example of a movie with a potentially really schlocky premise done really well. So this one was made by Neil Marshall, who also made The Descent, he made Doomsday, he made Centurion, also made that shitty Hellboy movie from a few years ago, but just forget about that one. This was his very first movie, and it's a really strong debut. A lot of Neil Marshall's movies kind of harken back to the sort of lower to mid-budget movies made in the 70s and 80s by guys like John Carpenter. I mean, the movie's basically like Assault on Precinct 13, but with werewolves, or Southern Comfort, if you've ever seen that one. It's a siege movie. It's, a bunch of people holing up in a house and holding off an attacking enemy. It's just that the enemy in this case happens to be werewolves. So because it's a low-budget movie, Neil Marshall knows the sort of rules you have to follow. So keep the cast small, film it in basically one location. Don't show the monsters too much, but when you do show them, make sure they look okay. But it's other little things that help this movie a lot. So for example, the characters aren't amazing. They're all fairly simple, but they're good enough that you actually give a shit about them, which is important for this type of movie. It's also got a sense of humor without falling into just out and out parody.
Hit me! Oh, you fucking pussy, hit me!
And the action's also pretty well done. A lot of it is sort of the, shot really close up and quickly edited type of action. But again, it's a low budget movie, so that's kind of what you have to do when working with a limited amount of money. So for people who aren't really familiar with Neil Marshall's work, or maybe you saw The Descent since that's his most popular one and you want to know where to go next, Dog Soldiers is a good pick.
You tried licking your own balls yet?
There's some movies that seem like they were born to be cult classics, and the movie I'm going to talk about today is definitely one of them. Number 9, Killer Clowns from Outer Space. Alright, now if you haven't seen the movie, some of you are probably thinking, Killer Clowns from Outer Space? What the hell is that? That sounds stupid as shit. And it is, but in a good way. There's a lot of movies that have outrageous titles or premises and then they don't live up to them. Like on my worst movies video, I talked about Bigfoot, which promised a lot, and then it was just a bunch of people fucking walking. This is a movie with a weird premise that actually delivers on it. It was directed by the Chiodo brothers, who were effects guys, which means all the clowns look really good. They kind of look like those CGI photos where they show like what cartoon characters would look like if they were real, like where they show if Homer Simpson was a real person. That's what the clowns look like in this movie. So they look awesome. They look just weird and kind of creepy, but kind of funny. And it also really has fun with the whole clown alien thing. So you get clowns making balloon animal dogs as like trackers. You have the scene where the clown's making the shadow puppets and then it turns into a T-Rex and eats people. You have John Vernon playing a hard ass, which is the role he was born to play, and then he gets turned into a ventriloquist dummy at the end. There's been a lot of clown movies recently. I don't know why, but it's them and Sharks seem to have really exploded in terms of like low budget direct to video or streaming or whatever horror movies. There's so many shitty clown horror movies and most of them are awful, but this one is worth a watch. This is like the OG evil clown movie. So yeah, Killer Clowns from Outer Space. It's one of those movies that almost sounds like a fake cult movie, but it actually exists, which is why it's a cult classic.
What are you going to do with those pies, boys?
There's some movies that seem like they were born to be cult classics, and the movie I'm going to talk about today is definitely one of them. Number 8, The Gate. I did not mean for that to rhyme, I promise. Alright, I've already talked about this one a lot, not just in my own previous best movies list, but also in Search of Darkness 3. I talk about that one, so I've already said a lot about The Gate. I'll try and keep this brief. My main pitch for this one is that if you're a parent who has a little kid and you want to introduce them to horror, this is a great place to start. Because it's a PG-13 horror movie, but it's an 80s PG-13, and it doesn't come across as a movie that was originally rated R and then got chopped down to a PG-13. It feels like it started there. And there's nothing too hardcore for kids, but it still feels genuinely like a horror movie. So it's not like, you know, The Halloween Tree or Worst Witch, which are just like happy little kids movies with some Halloween-y touches. This is actually a horror movie, but you're not starting them out with something R-rated like Jason or Saw or something like that. It's a really effects-driven movie. Some of them are really good, some of them are cheesy, but even the cheesy ones are entertaining. Kids are the main characters, but they're not annoying, which a lot of movies don't do. It's really hard to get that right, but this one does. So yeah, put this on for the kids and have them see the bad guy from Blade get an eyeball in his hand. There's some movies that seem like they were born to be cult classics, and the movie I'm going to talk about today is definitely one of them. Number 7, War of the Worlds. Now this one is the oldest movie on this list, which means it's also the most dated, and there are some, 50s isms in this movie that some people may not be able to get past. But it is also arguably one of the most important and influential movies I've ever done on this channel. It's one of those movies where if you looked up a list of best 50s sci-fi flicks, this is probably on there. And it's not the first alien invasion flick ever made, but this is the one that really set the template, at least for like the 50s style alien invasion flicks. The effects are really good for the time. Even if the movie doesn't use the tripods like in the original novel, I still kind of like the sort of flying manta ray look of the spaceships. They're a lot more unique than the typical flying saucer style spaceships you'd see in a 50s flick. This one also set a new standard for destruction in movies, because a lot of 50s sci-fi flicks don't really give you just the apocalyptic destruction that an alien invasion would entail. We get buildings exploding, empty streets, people panicking. A lot of later sci-fi movies like Independence Day just took the spectacle laid down in this one and just amped it up further. So again, there are a lot of 50s isms, like I think there's a scene with a reporter where he's got like the hat with like the number in it or whatever they used to do back then. It is a little dated, but if you're a fan of sci-fi history, it is still very much worth watching.
Everybody!
There's some movies that seem like they were born to be cult classics, and the movie I'm going to talk about today is definitely one of them. Number 6, Hardware. If you know me, you know I'm a sucker for cyberpunk, but this is one of the only cyberpunk horror movies I can think of. A lot of cyberpunk flicks are either like neo-noirs or action movies or stuff like that. So it's nice to have one about just a killer robot terrorizing people. This was made by Richard Stanley, who is mainly known now for being the guy who almost directed that 90s Island of Dr. Moreau movie, and there's a documentary on it, which is also really good. If you haven't seen that, you should watch it. But for a first-time movie, he shows a ton of talent here. I really, really like the sort of grungy, cyberpunky world shown here. You have stuff like taxis on pontoons, driven by Lemmy from Motorhead. There's just a real grungy, grimy look to this. Everything seems to have like smog and just grime everywhere. It's a really, really interesting cyberpunk world, and it doesn't feel affected at all. It feels genuine. Other cyberpunk movies I've done, like, for example, Johnny Mnemonic, even if they are kind of entertaining, they are sort of schlocky and not that great. This one has almost like an art movie feel, but in a good way. It's like an artsy killer robot movie, if that makes any sense. But this is a great underrated example, especially when you consider how much it cost. I think the budget was only like $1.5 million, which even in 1990 wasn't a lot of money. And it looks better than a lot of movies that cost like 10 times that amount. So good on Richard Stanley for making the most with his money. So for fans of Richard Stanley, or of cyberpunk, or just sci-fi horror movies, check out Hardware.
It's horrible. I love it.
There's some movies that seem like they were born to be cult classics, and the movie I'm going to talk about today is definitely one of them. Number 5, Repo Man. This is a movie that was practically born to be a cult classic. It's a sci-fi, punk rock, stoner, comedy, whatever movie. And the thing that's really impressive about it is that it manages to be really entertaining even though there's hardly any plot to it at all. There's like a thing in a trunk. Maybe it's aliens, maybe it's a nuclear weapon. It doesn't really matter. It's a MacGuffin anyway. And this is all contrasted with Emilio Estevez as a punk rock slacker who becomes a repo man, has some good times driving around doing coke with Harry Dean Stanton, because who wouldn't want to do that? Even at the end, it all kind of comes together, but not really. The ending is sort of like 2001: A Space Odyssey mixed with the ending of Grease. I know everything I'm saying sounds pretty confusing if you haven't seen the movie, but I think I'm describing the movie pretty accurately here. Also, a lot of movies I cover, even the good ones, tend to have sort of amateur actors in it. This one has some really, really good character actors. You got Harry Dean Stanton doing the type of role he was born to play. Tracy Walter, who's a really good character actor, playing just this burnt-out ex-hippie weirdo. You know a movie's good when it can just have characters monologuing or shooting the shit and it's still entertaining? Like, one of my favorite scenes in the movie is where Tracy Walter's just burning a bunch of shit in a bin, and he tells a story about how everything's connected in the cosmos, and it's just this weird, guy who's done too much acid rambling speech, but it's still really entertaining, and there's also a callback to it later in the movie, which shows some real attention to detail there. It's also got an awesome soundtrack, Iggy Pop, the Circle Jerks, and even though it's kind of considered a punk film, I think it's really more of like a stoner film. It's kind of got a mellow slacker vibe to it that's actually really charming. I have not seen the quasi-sequel Repo Chick. Apparently it's supposed to be pretty bad, but at least we have the original.
This is intense. Life with Repo Man is always intense.
There's some movies that seem like they were born to be cult classics, and the movie I'm going to talk about today is definitely one of them. Number 4, Life Force. Alright, this is another one that I've already talked about a bunch of times. It was my 100th episode special two-parter, so I'll try to keep this one a little brief. Naked space vampires. What more do I need to say? Alright, I'll say a little bit more. The main appeal of this movie is that it feels like what would normally be a low-budget drive-in movie or some weird find, like, you'd find some old VHS at a flea market and you're like, hey, can you believe this movie? But it's a big-budget, major release from the director of Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Poltergeist. It's got effects from the guy who did Star Wars. It's got a musical score from the guy who made the Pink Panther, which, by the way, the music in this movie is really underrated. You got Patrick Stewart making out with Steve Railsback. Where else are you going to see that? And I think the main appeal of this movie is that we will never see anything like it ever again, at least not on this budget. No one nowadays would make an R-rated movie where the lead actress walks around naked for most of it and then give it big budget effects and put well-known actors in it. It is just not happening. This is the kind of movie that only could have been made and released when it was. And that is what makes it special.
Use my body.
There's some movies that seem like they were born to be cult classics, and the movie I'm going to talk about today is definitely one of them. Number 3, Phantasm. So in the 70s and 80s, you had a lot of people making a big splash with low-budget horror movies. You had stuff like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, Evil Dead's another one. And this one tends to get overshadowed a little bit just because I think it's among so many other classic horror flicks. But it deserves a lot of attention too. Usually when a young director tries to make a low-budget horror flick, at least back then, it was like a slasher movie or a cabin in the woods type flick. This one's very, very different. Instead, it's more of a surreal nightmare type movie. And again, it's another one that has a kid as the main character, but the kid isn't annoying. You actually really root for this kid. The biggest strength it has, though, is Angus Scrimm as the Tall Man. The Tall Man, in my opinion, is one of the most underrated horror movie villains ever. He should be up there with guys like Jason and Freddy. I mean, he is the original Slender Man. Also, like a lot of horror movies, this one became a franchise, and a lot of the sequels are worthwhile too. I've done the first one on my show. I'll probably get to the other ones later. If If you've never seen it before, you might be a little surprised because again, the first one especially has more of like an artsy, surreal tone to it. There's a lot of things in it that don't really make sense or don't really resolve themselves or explain themselves. But if you've already watched like Jason and Freddy and all those other ones and are looking for a new horror franchise to start, Phantasm's a good one. There's some movies that seem like they were born to be cult classics, and the movie I'm going to talk about today is definitely one of them. Number 2, Creepshow. This is a movie that really captures the style of those old 1950s EC horror comics like Tales from the Crypt or Vault of Horror. I've said it before, but this is probably the best Tales from the Crypt movie, even though it's technically not a real Tales from the Crypt film. You can really tell George Romero and Stephen King were big fans. They get the look of it down, they get the style of it down, they get the twist endings, they get the black humor. The stories all seem like something you would see in an old EC horror comics tale, like the Crate in particular is something I can see appearing in an old EC horror comic from the time. You could put scenes of the Crypt Keeper in between the stories and it would fit perfectly. I wonder if somebody's done that on YouTube. I'll have to check. And most importantly, this is just one of the most unabashedly fun horror movies out there. It's a movie that's on the side of like the kid reading some horror comics even though he probably shouldn't be. And then when his dad takes it away from him, the kid stabs him with a voodoo doll at the end. This is a movie that knew that kids really like horror flicks, and it has the attitude of like, hey, this might be a little inappropriate for you, but you're gonna have a lot of fun watching it. Also, I can recommend any movie where Stephen King plays a dumb country hick and says stuff like this.
Meteor ship!
There's some movies that seem like they were born to be cult classics, and the movie I'm going to talk about today is definitely one of them. And number 1, Black Christmas. So this one's been number 1 on my list for a while now, and with good reason. A lot of the other movies on this list, even if they're good or entertaining, they're still kind of tongue-in-cheek or a little bit schlocky. This one is a genuinely good, underrated, scary horror flick. Halloween gets a lot of the credit for starting the slasher movie genre. I don't know why more people don't mention this one, because it's got a lot of the building blocks there. There's the POV shots with the heavy breathing. You got the final girl. You got the whole call is coming from inside the house cliche, but this movie did it first because it came out before When a Stranger Calls, so if you're the first movie to start a cliche, then it's okay. It manages to be scary and intense without being super gory. And one thing I really like about this movie a lot, and it's one thing that some people don't like about it, but I like that you never really know anything about the killer. You never see him, you just see like his hand or his eyeball or something. You never really know much about him. Maybe his name is Billy, maybe it isn't. You never know why he's doing what he's doing. He kind of gives like some hints to a backstory, but you don't get the whole thing. I think a lot of horror movie villains are scarier the less you know about them. And as far as pioneers in the slasher movie genre, this is one of the most important, and it's definitely one of the most underrated. Because like I said, a lot of people say it started with Halloween. I think a better starting point would be this one. I know there's some earlier ones like Psycho or Peeping Tom or whatever, but those were kind of more like 50s and 60s style, like psycho thrillers or like film noirs, just more intense. This is more like a slasher movie as we know it today. So if you're interested in horror history and just the evolution of the slasher movie, this is one of the best examples. So there you go. There's my updated list of best movies. And we'll see if there's any new ones when I do this 100 episodes from now. Be sure to let me know in the comments, what are your favorite movies that I've done? Any ones you think should have been on this list but weren't? Also, Patreon just got a new video player. I'm going to be trying to do more exclusive stuff on there because they are a lot less strict with the blocking and shit than YouTube is. So if you're interested in that, go to patreon.com/BrandonTenold, and I will see you later.